This is Special Military Operation 500 Days. It is the 500th day of the full-scale military invasion, and we are here waiting for friends to show up with a generator, at which point we will get the gobo spotlight on as well. But for now, Lord Laser just wants to place the Ukrainian flag on the embassy, make it a little bit smaller. We're going to make it turn. But it is there they are. It is important to us.
Oh my God.
To know every time big things happen that the Russians know we will be out here to drag them out of bed. That's a commitment that I made. I don't know, that if Ukrainians can't sleep, the Russian embassy staff shouldn't be able to sleep either. And so we are going to let this rotate for a couple minutes while we unpack the generator and get Heimar, the gobo projector, up and running. Why don't you just follow me for now?
Okay. Love your short.
So the generator makes a fair bit of noise, so we try to keep it away from where we're going to be. The last time I ran this generator at a protest, somebody walked up to me and said very enthusiastically, "It's the sound of Kiev." All right, we're going to set it on. We're going to make sure we have enough gas. We've got enough gas. Just for those who do not know, we would never project a Z or a V. The Russians project that on their own walls by way of drowning out our spotlights. All right, we are going to go up with the other one, and then we are going to start tonight's festivities and talk a little bit about what 500 days has meant. And we're going to talk about it, of course, in the form of projections. There we go. All right. So I'm going to try to remember all the things that people asked me to include in this. So a lot of people sent in 500 days of murder. A lot of people sent in 500 days of war crimes. We're going to leave both of those up for a while. Again, I want to stress that I am not projecting the Z and V spotlight. Not this time, not any other time. We project the Ukrainian flag, other Ukrainian images. We project slogans. The Russians project the Z and V on their own as a countermeasure. So 500 days of war crimes. We should talk a little bit on the walls of the embassy about what the 500 days of what, right? And it's 500 days of war crimes. It's 500 days of murder. There are 20,000, at least, probably many more, missing Ukrainian children who've been forcibly relocated into Russia. 500 days is 500 days of stolen children. And, we have the Russians, we have lots of euphemisms for this. And I don't think we should use any euphemism for it. These are stolen children Some of their families have been killed. Many of their families are alive and have had their children taken from them. Remember, among the many crimes that have taken place, we're not just talking about people murdered. We're not just talking about buildings bombed. We're talking about children who have been forcibly removed from their homes, from their families, from their country, and are being, many of them, sent to the Russian Far East. Okay, let's talk about 500 days of rape. Another thing we should not use euphemistic rhetoric to talk about. There has been systematic sexual violence in all of the areas that Russia has occupied. That includes Bucha, where there was, a great deal of evidence of it was uncovered and talked about immediately after the Russians were forced out. But every single jurisdiction in which the Russian army has been forced out of, every single area that has been liberated, the same story, and it is wide-scale, large-scale sexual violence against large numbers of people. We do not know the full scope of it. We may never know the full scope of it. But when people say it's the 500th day of the war, keep in mind, that's what they're talking about too. We've had 500 days of bombings. This has not stopped. In fact, as Ukraine has increasingly prevailed in the war, the bombings of purely civilian infrastructure and architecture have increased. This has ranged from daily bombardments of civilian areas in certain parts of the country. It has also included almost nightly in different times bombing, drone bombings of Kiev, airstrikes against Lviv the other day. These serve no discernible military purpose. Every single one of these is a war crime. You can look at the apartment buildings that have been hit. These are hit halfway up, large apartment buildings. These are not sites that are being used by the Ukrainian military, by the armed forces of Ukraine. These are civilian targets targeted because they are civilian targets. That's been going on for 500 days. I want to stress that, I had sort of started this with the idea that we were going to list 500 days of horrible things, but the NAFO fellas quickly reminded me that there are a million inspirational stories here too, and that for every one of these days there is a different collection of heroes, people who have done incredibly heroic things in their personal lives, in helping one another, in the military sphere, in the civilian sphere, in the fundraising sphere, and people who have housed refugees all over Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Slovakia, in Estonia, people who have never thought they would take up arms, who took up arms. Just the number of inspirational stories that have happened over the last 500 days is awe-inspiring. One place it has not happened, that there have been literally no inspiring stories, is in that building. Look, at the end of the day, all of these different crimes add up to one big crime. And I want you to pause here and think about the fact that the people in this building will put a Z on top of the Ukrainian flag. And if I show up here and project a Ukrainian flag, they will actually try to blot it out. And that is an incredible metaphor. It's not even a metaphor, it's an example of what of who this government is and what they are trying to do. A symbol of the Ukrainian nation has to be blotted out. And that is exactly what they are doing in occupied spaces. They are removing historical artifacts, cultural artifacts. They are destroying some. They are relocating others to Russia. They are killing people, taking children, using sexual violence as a weapon. And what does it all amount to? It all amounts to an attempt to eradicate a nation. And so I'm going to move this Ukrainian flag because I want you to think about, I'm going to move it, and what's going to happen, it may take a little while because they're, maybe a little bit drunk in there, but pretty soon they're going to realize that I've moved it and they're not covering it up anymore. And when they figure that out, they're going to move a Z down into it. And we can play that game. We can play cat and mouse with them, and they're always suckers for it because they actually don't like that flag, that symbol, unobstructed, and it upsets them when that symbol is unencumbered. And so when that Z moves, whatever words are playing at that time, I want you to think about the 500 days of genocide. All right, so let's talk about 500 days of Ukrainian heroes. We kind of already did when we talked about 500 days of fighting for freedom, but the heroism is unbelievable, and it's not just military, though it is military. Remember when we all thought that Kiev would fall in 3 days? Remember when we, it would be an impressive behind-the-lines guerrilla fight, but there was no way that the army would stand up against the Russian military. I don't think anybody inside or outside of Ukraine anticipated the reaction of the emigre community, the Eastern European capacity to absorb and take care of refugees, the extent to which Ukrainians would kind of win the hearts of the rest of the world. I don't think anybody anticipated that tens of thousands of Ukrainians would be working to send back remittances to essentially to the military effort. I've never seen anything like it. I'm not. It has an awe-inspiring quality, and I don't know anybody who isn't moved by it, at least not who's spent any time with it. And I also want to say in Washington, thank you. One of the groups of people, thank you, that we have to deal with a lot in Washington are the diplomats, because we're in Washington. And I learned something like stunning the other day, which is that the entire Ukrainian embassy is currently staffed with 15 diplomats. Now, let's pause over that number for a minute. It is not 50, it is 15, 1-5. There are some other administrative staff in the building, but there are 15 diplomats in that building. And if you think about the incredible amount of work that that group of people has had to do representing their country, interfacing with Americans of all different political stripes, helping to keep the coalition that supports Ukraine genuinely bipartisan, genuinely nonpartisan. That is a pretty awe-inspiring thing. It's not military. It funds the Ukrainian military, but it's not a military heroism. It's a diplomatic kind of heroism, and I think it stands in remarkable contrast to the people in this building. According to the New York Times the other day, the staff of this embassy is down to down below 200 people. They all live in the compound, by the way. And what are they representing? Genocide, imperialism, murder, and war crimes. All right, let's talk about 500 days too many. This war was completely unnecessary. It didn't need to happen. Even Yevgeny Prigozhin the other day announced that the pretext for the war was bullshit. That Ukraine didn't need denazification. There is a country, by the way, in that region that needs denazification. It isn't Ukraine. And this was a country that posed no threat to Russia. There were already significant numbers of Russian troops on Ukrainian soil, in Donbass, in Crimea. So there was already aggression from 2014. This was not a situation where Ukraine was threatening Russia. This was a situation in which Russia decided on its own, for reasons of imperial delusion, to invade a neighboring country in a fashion that we really have not seen since World War II. 500 days of fearful families. So let's start with the obvious point that the families have every reason to be fearful. What's going on is completely frightening and has separated a huge number of families, both by killing members of them. A lot of children have been killed. A lot of parents have been killed. As we mentioned before, a large number of children have also been stolen. And if you want to think about how terrifying, what it means for there to be a fearful family, think about, I did tell you that the Z would move, and when it moves to cover up that Ukrainian flag, remember the 500 days of genocide, because that symbol is what all of this is about destroying and preventing. And so, just think about the fact that I could tell you that that was going to happen. Think about the fact that I could say, I'm moving this flag, and the Z will move to follow it, because this flag needs to be covered up on this building. Just think about that. Think about how that's connected with the murdering of people. Think about how that's connected with the seizure of territory, the forcing of people to grow up speaking a language that is not their language. And think about how that's related to that you're getting a visual image of that is symbolic of, that is representative of the behavior that we see at so many levels of violence on the ground. I'm going to move the flag again, and I'm going to put it in a place where the Z and V spotlights can't get it, which is right here. on the side of the building and in the tree. And this is my favorite spot because there is just nothing they can do about it.
Hopefully it shines in their other windows.
Yeah, and I also like the way these projections look on trees. What else we got?
500 days of Russian cruelty. 500 days of refugees. 500 days of suffering.
Let's talk about the refugees. 500 days of refugees. So, first of all, the number of refugees is really amazing. I mean, you're talking millions of externally displaced people and millions of internally displaced people. You know, a lot of them, particularly in the early days of the war, were fleeing extreme violent circumstances. But even as recently as 2 weeks ago, a friend of mine in Odessa, again, I'm going to be vague because I don't know that she would want me to identify her. I hadn't heard from her for a while, so I wrote her a note to check in on her, and she had refused to leave the country for the first 18 months. Now her parents' house had been under aerial bombardment for the third time, and she felt the need to take her family to safety. So she is now no longer in Odessa, and that was 2 weeks ago. So you know, we have the sense of the front as having somewhat stabilized. The mass migrations of people is a thing to some degree of 2022, and yet it's still happening. It's still happening every day. And in fact, standing in back of me are a couple, don't show their faces unless they want to, who live in my neighborhood and have just organized a sponsor group for a refugee family who's just moved to this neighborhood from Kiev, having had enough of living in the subway station. And so the refugee crisis continues. It's not something that was just a flood of 5 million people into Poland and Estonia and Slovakia and the Czech Republic in 2022. It's still going on. People ask all the time, what can we do? And of course, the answer, in addition to supporting politicians in this country who are going to be supportive of Ukraine, is you can help refugees. And there are refugees in your communities. There are refugees who need sponsors. There is a whole program for Americans who want to sponsor Ukrainian refugees or non-Ukrainian refugees. So 500 days of Russian cruelty and Ukrainian resilience. I think we've talked about each of these themes already. But one of the striking things when these areas are liberated is how barbaric the behavior of the Russian troops has been, and the incredible, I don't know what to call it, savagery of Russian behavior in areas that they've occupied, which include everything from, you know, looting every washing machine in Bucha and elsewhere, to very systematic rapes and sexual violence, to torture. We actually haven't put up 500 days of torture, but maybe we should. POWs are coming home having been treated really vilely over long periods of time, having been named. And you see some of these people who are returned who are, look like concentration camp victims. And these are needless cruelties. And yet, these are, people are going on and making the country work, helping each other and picking up the pieces. And I do think, obviously that shouldn't lessen our disgust for the brutalities. It does remind you very starkly of the difference between the two sides here. And, I'm not an essentialist. I don't believe this is anything inherent about Russia or Russians. I do think that the training to savagery that we have seen here, and some of it you can see in Prigozhin's videos. He boasts about it. The sledgehammer as a symbol of the Wagner forces because they beat in people's heads with them. It's a remarkable testament to how you can train people to cruelty, how you can learn it, and also how you can resist it and choose to be among the people who helps others pick up the pieces and restores a functional society. All right. Are there more, or?
Not really. I mean,
Well, in that case,
500 days. Okay, there's 100 days of mother's tears. 500 days of inspiring bravery.
I think we kind of already did that
Yeah.
one.
You can scroll if you want.
It's okay.
500 days of Allied support.
Ooh, very nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, so 500 days of Allied support and solidarity. So the ambassador in that building, Mr. Antonov, put on his Telegram account the other day the first statement he's made in a long time that I really agreed with. And I agreed with it only almost unironically. He said that the U.S. support for Ukraine, which he called Nazi Ukraine, was going to become an indelible part of U.S. history. And I thought, yeah, that's exactly right. And we live with some behavior in this country that we're not proud of. Like, I don't know a lot of people who are really excited about the Vietnam War anymore. And I certainly don't know people who are, proud of the fact that we invaded the Philippines and took it over and ruled it for 50 years. But I think it's interesting that apart from the far right, the Trumpist right, and the very far left, the only debate among the reasonable U.S. center-right, center-left, and reasonable left is whether we should be doing, how much more we should be doing for Ukraine. And that same debate is taking place in Germany. It's not taking place in places like Estonia and Eastern Europe, where they're doing so much as a matter of GDP. There's just a percentage of GDP. There's just an acceptance that's kind of cross-partisan that that's going to happen. But we've had 500 days of only arguing about how much more we should do. And France has had 500 days of arguing about how much more they should do. And the different allied countries come to different answers to that. But nobody has come to the view, except Hungary, has come to the view that they should be doing less. And I want to say that that's special, that that's important, and that that's meaningful. That, 5 years ago, if you'd said, what's the state of the Western alliance? People would have said it's in some degree of crisis, and it probably was. It's not in crisis anymore, and it's in a remarkably robust place. It's growing. We just added Finland to NATO. We're going to add Sweden to NATO. And President Erdogan of Turkey, for whom my enthusiasm, I assure you, is under control, has expressed his support for adding Ukraine. So yeah, 500 days, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, weapon systems that we never thought we would actually see in action against Russian forces, and everything from Leopard tanks to F-16s to HIMARS, for whom HIMAR, the Gogo projector, is named, all in service and more on the way. So yeah, 500 days of Allied support and solidarity. What do you think? Should we do more, or?
About the destruction of culture.
I
mean, they've been bombing UNESCO World Heritage Sites. The Lviv strike actually struck the buffer zone.
Come closer to the microphone and talk about it. And introduce yourself.
Do you want me to show you?
This is the great Allegra.
Hi, I am a member of heroism, an advocacy group supporting Ukraine. And I'm just going to quickly bring up destruction of culture. Ukraine has an ancient culture. They have many sites from the ancient Thracians, the ancient Greeks, and onwards that have come under fire by Russian missiles. I actually studied Greek history in undergrad, and I learned about many Ukrainian sites when I heard about Russian missiles being shot near them. And by contrast, you hear stories, for instance, in Odessa, when they were digging defensive trenches, they found in amphora a Greek vase, and they managed to get it out fairly intact and are donating it to a local museum. So yet again, there's another example of comparison there between the two sides. There's also the fact that Russians have been looting museums throughout Ukraine, taking ancient gold, including from those early cultures, and more contemporary paintings. So they have been directly attacking Ukrainian culture. Now, many Ukrainian artists have come under fire. Some have died. Most recently, there was Victoria Amelina. She was a novelist and a poet who took time to document war crimes instead. She was injured in a strike on Kramatorsk and later died of her wounds on July 1st. So it is an attack on a people's culture as well as the people themselves.
Other thoughts?
It is in the interest of the world to stop bullies.
Come closer so that people can hear you.
It is in the interest of the world to stop bullies before they can get a foothold and before they decide that their way of wiping out cultures and countries actually makes sense to them. If we don't stand up to bullies now, it'll be 10 times worse later.
Hear, hear. Folks, I'm going to sign off now. Remember that the 501st day is tomorrow. We observe the 500th day because, big round numbers are easier to get your heads around for some reason. But the 501st day, when nobody's paying attention, is just as important to the person who gets hurt on it. Maybe more important because no one's paying attention. And so, keep your minds open, your wallets open, your homes open, and, Slava Ukraini.